The sun didn't just rise over Omen's reach. It bled across the horizon, staining the dust-choked streets of the Arizona Territory in shades of bruised purple and crimson. At 25, Elara Vance knew the desert better than she knew herself. She knew it was a cruel master that gave nothing and took everything eventually. It had taken her mother 10 years ago, and it tried to take her sanity every long, quiet afternoon at the telegraph station. Elara stood on the porch, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She and her father, Silas, ran the station together as partners now. He handled the politics of the town. She handled the machines and the rifles. Silas was the town's heartbeat, the man who translated the clicks and clacks of copper wire into news from a civilized world they rarely saw. But this morning, the wire was dead. The usual rhythmic humming was replaced by a sickening silence. "Pa," the line severed east of the ridge, Elara called out, her voice steady, devoid of panic. She was used to trouble. When she got no answer, she stepped inside. The smell hit her instantly, the copper tang of fresh blood mixed with the sulfurous stench of spent gunpowder. The office was wrecked. The telegraph key, their livelihood, was smashed into brass kindling on the floor. Silas was gone. There was a scuffle pattern in the dust and 3 distinct sets of boot tracks leading out the back door. Heavy, spurred, arrogant tracks, accompanied by the deep indentations of Missouri mules. Elara didn't gasp. She didn't run to the sheriff, a man whose courage she had personally seen dissolve into a whiskey bottle years ago. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. This wasn't a random robbery. This was personal. She walked calmly to the living quarters behind the office. She pulled a heavy, iron-bound trunk from under her cot. Inside lay her inheritance. Not jewelry or silk, but a neatly oiled Spencer repeating rifle and a long-barreled Colt Navy revolver that had once belonged to her mother, an Army scout before the fever took her. Over the last decade, Elara hadn't just polished those guns. She had mastered them. She strapped on the gun belt, the leather feeling familiar and comforting against her hip. She grabbed a canteen and a satchel of ammunition. In the desert, there are only 2 kinds of people, the predators and the prey. Elara Vance was done being prey. The trail led north, straight toward the jagged, sun-baked teeth of the Red Canyons, a place where the law stopped at the border because the rocks offered too many hiding spots for ambush. Elara saddled her mare, Bess, a tough, sour-tempered animal that could smell water 5 miles away. She rode at a steady trot, her eyes scanning the scrubland, reading the story written in the broken twigs and disturbed earth. She knew exactly who she was following. Only one outfit in the territory was brazen enough to hit a federal telegraph station in broad daylight. The Blackwell Gang, led by Caleb Blackwell, a former Confederate officer whose bitterness had curdled into pure viciousness. They were anti-railroad, anti-government, and anti-anyone who got in their way. As the sun reached its zenith, turning the canyon into a blast furnace, Elara found the first sign of her father 4 miles in. It was his spectacles, cracked and lying near a patch of prickly pear. Nearby, weighted down by a rock, was a ripped page from a ledger. On it, charcoal scrawled 2 words, "Devil's Throat." She knew the spot. It was a tactical nightmare, a narrow limestone bottleneck where the wind screamed like a banshee, drowning out the sound of approaching horses. It was the perfect kill box. Elara wasn't foolish enough to ride straight in. She knew Caleb Blackwell would have a rear guard, watching their back trail. A mile from the canyon entrance, she dismounted, tied Bess to a sturdy mesquite bush, and began to climb. She wasn't a nimble teenager anymore. She was a grown woman with strength in her shoulders. She scaled the sharp sandstone chimney, ignoring the scrapes on her hands, until she was 100 feet above the canyon floor, perched on a precarious rim that overlooked the winding path below. From her high vantage point, lying flat on her belly, she saw them through the shimmering heat haze. Caleb Blackwell was a mountain of a man, wearing a canvas, duster coat stained dark with what she hoped was just mud. 2 subordinates were with him, one wiry and twitchy, known as Lefty, and a shorter, heavily scarred man whose name she didn't know. They had Silas seated on a rock, his hands bound tightly behind his back. He looked exhausted, a bruise darkening the side of his face, but he held his head up. "Time's wasting, old man," Caleb's voice boomed, echoing strangely against the canyon walls. "The Army payroll stage is due through the pass in 2 hours. You're going to splice that wire, tap in, and send the signal. You'll tell the escort commander there's an Apache war party at the South Fork. Send them right into the box canyon where we'll be waiting." Silas spat a wad of bloody saliva onto the dusty boot of his captor. "I'd rather die right here, Caleb. I won't send good men to a slaughter." Caleb wiped his boot slowly, then chuckled, a dry, hateful sound. He drew his massive Remington revolver and cocked the hammer right next to Silas's ear. "You might be ready to die, Silas, but are you ready for your daughter to die? Because after we're done here, we're going back to Omen's Reach to finish the job." High above on the rim, Elara felt a frigid calm settle over her. The anger burned away, leaving only icy calculation. She wasn't a damsel, and her father wasn't just a victim. They were the only thing standing between those monsters and a massacre. She reached into her satchel. She didn't just have bullets. She pulled out 2 sticks of dynamite, stolen from a mining claim jumper a year back, and a handful of blasting caps. She knew the geography of this canyon. The walls were unstable sandstone. She didn't need to outshoot 3 hardened killers. She just needed to bring the mountain down around them. As the sun began to dip behind the western rim, casting long, distorted shadows across the devil's throat, Elara moved. She didn't scramble. She flowed down the backside of the ridge with practiced stealth. The Blackwells had set up a temporary camp near where the telegraph line dipped low. The wiry man Lefty was standing guard by their mules, nervously spinning his rifle. Elara picked up a fist-sized chunk of quartz and hurled it hard into the dried brush on the opposite side of the canyon floor. Crack, snap. Lefty spun around, bringing his Winchester to his shoulder. "Who's there? Did you hear that, boss?" Silence stretched. "Probably just a coyote," Caleb yelled from near the telegraph pole. "Keep your eyes open." Lefty took 5 cautious steps toward the noise, away from the mules. That was far enough. Elara rose from behind a boulder like a phantom. She didn't use her gun. Gunfire was too loud too soon. She used the heavy steel barrel of her mother's Colt Navy. One concise, brutal strike to the temple, and Lefty collapsed without a sound. Working quickly, she slashed the tethers on their mules and slapped their haunches hard with her hat. The animals bolted, their panicked hoofbeats thundering down the narrow pass, creating chaos. "The mules! Damn it, Lefty, hold them!" shouted the scarred man. Caleb and the scarred man ran toward the commotion, leaving Silas unguarded for precious seconds. This was her window. She sprinted to her father, knife already in hand. "Pa," she said, her voice low and urgent. Silas looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief that shifted quickly to paternal fear. "Elara? Good God, girl, what are you doing here? They'll kill you." "They tried that already with you," she said grimly, sawing through the thick ropes. She pulled the confiscated Winchester from Lefty's prone body and shoved it into Silas's hands. "Can you still shoot straight with that eye?" Silas stood up, wincing, but gripped the rifle with familiarity. The old defiance returned to his face. "Straight enough for these bastards. Lefty's down. It's an ambush." Caleb roared from the near darkness. "Find them." A bullet whined off the rock inches from Elara's head, spraying stone splinters. She and her father dove behind a thick slab of fallen limestone. They're pinned behind the slab. Caleb yelled to his remaining man, "Scarface, move right, flank them, flush them out." Elara had anticipated the flank. It was textbook tactics. Earlier, on her way down, she had wedged one of the dynamite sticks into a deep fissure in the canyon wall on the right side, a structural weak point she'd spotted years ago on a geological survey trip. She had rigged a short fuse. As the scarred man scrambled over the rocks to get a side angle on them, Elara leaned out from cover, bringing her Spencer rifle up. She wasn't aiming at the man. She aimed at the small, sputtering fuse she had lit moments before. "Cover your ears, Pa," she yelled. Boom! The explosion was deafening in the confined space. It wasn't enough to level the mountain, but it was enough to shatter the precarious sandstone shelf above the scarred man. A cascade of rock, dust, and shale rained down, burying him under tons of debris. The dust cloud was thick, choking the air. Now it was only Caleb. The gang leader stepped into the clearing, coughing, his duster billowing around him. He held a revolver in each hand, his eyes wild with fury in the twilight. "You cowardly bitch," Caleb screamed into the dust. "Come out and fight like a man. You think you can beat me with tricks?" Elara stepped out from behind the limestone slab. She stood tall, 25 years of frontier hardship stiffening her spine. The wind whipped her hair around her face. She looked him dead in the eye, her own Colt Navy leveled at his chest. "I don't want to fight like a man, Caleb," she said, her voice ringing clear in the sudden silence. "I'm fighting like a daughter protecting her own." Caleb sneered and raised both guns, intent on turning her into a sieve. But he was looking into the setting sun, and she was just a silhouette against the blinding orange light. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Caleb's bullet threw up dirt near Elara's boot. Elara's bullet didn't miss. It took him squarely in the center of his chest, punching through the heavy canvas of his coat. He staggered backward 2 steps, a look of profound shock on his face, before his knees buckled and he collapsed face first into the red dirt. The silence that followed the gunfire was heavy. The wind died down as if in respect. Silas walked over to his daughter. He didn't treat her like a child in need of comfort. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder, a gesture of equal respect. They stood over the body of the man who had terrorized the territory for 5 years. "You got a hell of an aim, Elara," Silas said quietly. "Learn from the best," she replied, holstering her smoking gun. They spent the night gathering the remaining gang member, Lefty, who had woken up with a massive headache, and repairing the telegraph line as best they could by moonlight. When they rode back into Omen's Reach the next morning, leading a tied-up outlaw and carrying the news of Caleb Blackwell's end, the townspeople came out of their homes in stunned silence. They saw Silas Vance, battered but unbroken, and riding beside him, tall in the saddle, was Elara. She wasn't just the woman who ran the telegraph office anymore. The way she held herself, the cold steel in her gaze, told a different story. The telegraph wire was fully operational by noon. The first message Elara tapped out wasn't to the army or the marshals. It was a general broadcast to every station on the line, a warning to any other gangs thinking Omen's Reach was an easy target. It read simply, "The line is open. Blackwell is dead. Omen's Reach is protected." In the saloons and trail camps across the territory, the legend grew. They stopped talking about the Blackwell Gang. They started whispering about the woman in Omen's Reach who brought down a mountain on her enemies. They called her the Ghost of Red Canyon, and Elara Vance, cleaning her rifle on the porch as the sun set, let them talk. She knew the truth. She wasn't a ghost. She was just a woman who had drawn a line in the sand that no man would ever cross again.